June 17, 1944, mid-Atlantic Ocean, approximately 30 nautical miles west of the Azores. Captain Lieutenant Helmut Sommer stood in the cramped control room of U-853, his fingers resting on the edge of the navigation table. Through the periscope lens, he could see nothing but endless grey water stretching toward the horizon under low clouds. The Type 9C submarine had been on station for 3 weeks, assigned to weather reporting duties, transmitting atmospheric data back to headquarters in France every 6 hours. The radio man looked up from his console, headphones pressed against his ears. "Her crew prepared to transmit weather report." Smir nodded. The message had been prepared using the Kurz-Signaly code system condensed into a brief sequence of encrypted letters, 25 characters. With an experienced operator, the transmission would take approximately 20 seconds. Standard procedure quick enough to avoid detection by the old British direction-finding equipment, which required nearly a minute to obtain a bearing on a radio signal. Within 10 minutes, aircraft from the American escort carrier USS Croatan would arrive overhead. Within 10 days, those same aircraft would locate U-853 again. Sommer and his crew had been taught that brief radio transmissions offered safety. They believed the ocean still provided concealment. They were operating with assumptions that had become obsolete months earlier, hunting them with technology they did not know existed. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic would not announce itself with dramatic revelation. It arrived through accumulated encounters, through close escapes that should not have happened, through destroyers that appeared impossibly fast after routine transmissions. German submarine commanders would spend the spring and summer of 1943 attempting to understand why the ocean no longer sheltered them, why Allied escorts seemed to anticipate their positions, why aircraft arrived within minutes of sending even the shortest signals. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The realization would come gradually, spreading through the U-boat force like cold water seeping through a failing seal. By mid-1943, seasoned commanders returning from patrol would gather in the officers' mess at Laron, speaking in low voices about encounters they could not explain. Escorts that changed course directly toward their position immediately after transmitting. Aircraft that appeared from clear skies moments after surfacing to send mandatory reports. The mathematics of survival were changing and no one at Befehlshaber der UNICEBOOT headquarters in Paris seemed willing to acknowledge it. Between 1939 and 1945, German U-boat would sink approximately 3,000 Allied merchant vessels totaling over 14 million gross registered tons. These losses nearly brought Britain to starvation, threatened the entire Allied war effort, and represented the closest Germany came to winning the war through purely naval means. But by May 1943, the balance had shifted irreversibly. That month, later known as Black May among submariners, 41 U-boats were lost, a quarter of the operational fleet. The exchange ratio that had once favored Germany collapsed. Instead of sinking 100,000 tons of shipping for every U-boat lost, the ratio fell to 10,000 tons per boat. Then lower. The weapon that helped accomplish this reversal was not a torpedo or depth charge. It was a receiver, an antenna array and an oscilloscope display. High-frequency direction finding called Huff-Duff by the sailors who operated it could detect a U-boat's radio transmission and display the bearing to that transmission essentially instantaneously. 2 or 3 ships equipped with this technology could triangulate a submarine's position with accuracy sufficient to dispatch aircraft or surface hunters directly to the target area. It is estimated that HFDF contributed to 24% of all U-boat sinkings during the war. When Captain Lieutenant Smir took command of U-853 in June 1943, he inherited a vessel and a doctrine shaped by early war successes. The Type 9C was a proven design, displacing 1,144 tons on the surface and 1,257 tons submerged. At 76 m in length, the submarine could travel 21,000 nautical miles without refueling, carrying enough provisions for patrols lasting 3 months. The boat mounted 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft, with storage for 22 torpedoes. A single 8.8 cm deck gun and anti-aircraft weapons provided surface armament. The crew numbered 48 men. These were not primitive vessels. German submarine design represented sophisticated engineering informed by 2 decades of development since the Great War. Each boat featured complex trim systems for precise depth control, demagnetization equipment to protect against magnetic mines, and passive sonar arrays for detecting enemy ships. The diesel engines could propel the submarine at 18 knots on the surface. Submerged, running on electric motors, the boat could maintain 7 knots for extended periods or sprint at 7 3/4 knots for 1 hour before battery depletion forced surfacing. The men who crewed these submarines received extensive training. Smyr himself had completed submarine school, tactical courses, and supervised 2 patrols as executive officer before receiving his own command. His crew drilled constantly on emergency procedures, practiced silent running, studied convoy tactics, and memorized the recognition characteristics of Allied warship classes. They understood their equipment intimately. They knew how to calculate attack angles, how to read sonar contacts, how to interpret the sounds of distant propellers carried through ocean layers. What they did not know, what they could not know in mid-1943 was that their enemy had developed detection capabilities that rendered traditional submarine tactics nearly obsolete. German Naval Command understood that radio direction finding existed. Admiral Karl Donitz, who had commanded U-Boat in the previous war and now directed the entire submarine force, knew that transmitting could theoretically reveal position. This awareness had driven the development of Kurz signal, the short signal code system designed specifically to minimize transmission time below the threshold required for conventional direction finding equipment to obtain a bearing. The Marines' assumptions about Allied capabilities were based on technology they themselves possessed. German direction-finding equipment used the Bellini-Tossi system, which employed a rotating loop antenna that had to be physically turned until the operator detected a null in the signal strength. This process required time, typically 1 minute or more, for an accurate bearing. A transmission lasting 20 seconds would be finished before the operator could complete the measurement. Therefore, logic suggested brief signals offered protection. This calculation was correct. Regarding the technology Germany knew about, it was catastrophically wrong regarding the technology Britain and America had deployed. By mid-1942, Royal Navy escorts were being equipped with shipboard HFDF sets that required no mechanical rotation, no manual searching for signal nulls. The British system used an array of fixed antennas connected to a cathode ray oscilloscope display. When a transmission occurred, the display showed the bearing immediately as an elliptical pattern on the screen. An experienced operator could read the bearing in seconds. 2 ships with this equipment could cross-reference their bearings and establish the transmitting submarine's position with useful accuracy. 3 ships could triangulate precisely. The technology had evolved from research conducted in the 1920s by Robert Watson Watt, who had been attempting to develop a system for tracking lightning strikes to provide storm warnings to pilots. His apparatus used the Adcock antenna design for vertical elements arranged in a square pattern which received signals with minimal distortion from ground reflection. Connected to an oscilloscope, this system could display the direction to any electrical discharge instantaneously. Watson Watt's work remained relatively obscure until the late 1930s, when British naval intelligence recognized its potential application against enemy submarines. The first HFDF installations appeared on Royal Navy vessels in 1941. Production increased throughout 1942. By June of that year, the United States Navy had begun a program to equip half of all new destroyer escorts with HFDF systems. These installations proliferated rapidly. The shore-based network of direction-finding stations around Britain, Iceland, and North America provided strategic intelligence on U-boat movements across the Atlantic. The shipboard systems provided tactical intelligence, allowing convoy escorts to respond immediately to any submarine that transmitted within detection range. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz directed the U-boat war from headquarters outside Paris with meticulous attention to operational detail. His command style emphasized central control, with U-boat commanders required to report their positions, fuel status, torpedo expenditure, and convoy sightings regularly. When a submarine located an Allied convoy, standard procedure required the boat to shadow the formation while transmitting the contact reports that would allow Donitz to concentrate other submarines in the area into a Wolfpack for coordinated night surface attacks. This tactical approach had proven devastatingly effective during the early war years. Between 1940 and 1942, coordinated Wolfpack operations sank hundreds of Allied merchant ships. The system worked because Donitz could position his submarines across probable convoy routes using radio communication to mass forces at the critical point. One submarine would locate the target, others would converge, and the pack would attack together, overwhelming the escorts through superior numbers. The doctrine required radio communication. Without regular position reports, Donitz could not coordinate operations. Without contact reports, he could not concentrate forces. Without tactical signals, Wolfpack attacks could not be properly sequenced. The entire operational system depended on U-boat transmitting from sea. Donitz understood this created vulnerability. But he believed the Kurd signal system provided adequate protection. The messages were brief. They were encrypted using Enigma machines before transmission. The submarine commanders were instructed to transmit quickly and minimize radiation of signals that might be detected. What Donitz and his staff did not fully comprehend until too late was that the Allied direction-finding network no longer needed long transmissions to obtain useful bearings. A 202 Kurt signal was more than adequate for HFDF operators to establish position. Multiple transmissions over several days created a pattern that convoy routing authorities could use to direct merchant ships away from U-boat concentrations. Even a single brief signal could trigger an immediate response from nearby escorts equipped with shipboard HFDF, bringing destroyers or aircraft to the transmission point within minutes. The German naval staff received warnings. Some U-boat commanders returning from patrol reported suspiciously rapid responses from Allied escorts after routine transmissions. Intelligence analysts noted an uncomfortable correlation between radio signals and subsequent attacks. But accepting that the Allies possessed instantaneous direction-finding capability would require abandoning the entire operational doctrine that had achieved success during 1940 through 1942. It would require admitting that the enemy held a decisive technological advantage. It would require fundamentally restructuring U-boat tactics away from coordinated Wolfpack operations toward individual patrol. Donitz resisted this conclusion. In August 1943, after losses had mounted catastrophically during the spring and summer, he issued a current order to his submarine commanders attempting to explain the situation. The message acknowledged that the enemy had developed effective methods for locating U-boat through their radio transmissions, possibly using long-range reconnaissance aircraft in combination with direction-finding equipment. The order tightened radio discipline further, demanding that commanders transmit only when absolutely necessary, use off frequencies when possible, and maintain strict silence during rendezvous operations. But the order could not eliminate radio communication entirely. The operational system still required position reports, weather data, convoy sightings, and tactical coordination. U-boat still needed to receive orders from headquarters. The basic architecture of centralized command and Wolfpack tactics remained unchanged, which meant the vulnerability remained unchanged. The submarines would continue transmitting, and the Allies would continue tracking them with technology the Germans could neither match nor effectively counter. By late 1943, experienced U-boat commanders understood they were being hunted through methods they could not see. They knew that transmitting attracted danger. They recognized that Allied escorts responded with uncanny speed and accuracy after radio signals, but they received orders from Donitz demanding continued operations, continued reporting, continued attempts to locate and attack convoys. The boats sailed, the radios transmitted, and the casualties accumulated at rates that exceeded shipyard production capacity. The faith in brief transmissions, in encrypted signals, in the protection offered by speed and stealth, had been rendered obsolete by a technology few German sailors fully understood. The ocean that had once sheltered submarines had become a surveilled medium, where every radio pulse potentially marked position for enemies equipped with instantaneous detection equipment. The transformation was complete, though many submarine crews would not fully comprehend what had changed until they heard the sound of aircraft engines overhead moments after their radio man finished sending a routine weather report. The encounter that would demonstrate HFDF's capabilities to Smir and his crew occurred on June 17, 1944, though they would not understand what had happened until much later. At approximately 1,100 hours, U-853 surfaced to periscope depth and raised her radio antenna. The radio man transmitted the scheduled weather report occurred signal of 25 encrypted characters taking 19 seconds to send. The message contained atmospheric pressure readings, wind direction and speed, sea state, and cloud cover observations required by German meteorological services attempting to predict conditions over the Atlantic. 30 nautical miles away aboard the escort carrier USS Croatan, a high-frequency direction-finding operator watched his oscilloscope display. The moment U-853's transmission began, an elliptical pattern appeared on his screen. He aligned a cursor with the peaks of the display, noted the bearing, and called it out to the watch officer. 285 degrees. The bearing was immediately plotted on the chart table. Within 90 seconds, 3 aircraft had been launched. The TBF Avenger torpedo bombers carried depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, and enough fuel for a 4-hour patrol. Summer ordered the submarine to dive immediately after the transmission finished. Standard procedure. U-853 descended to 70 m and proceeded at 4 knots, changing course to complicate any pursuit. The crew secured from radio watch and returned to routine patrol operations. They had transmitted for less than 20 seconds. By their understanding of Allied capabilities, this should have provided safety. 10 minutes later, the sonar operator reported distant propeller sounds, aircraft, multiple engines. Summer ordered silent running, all non-essential equipment shut down, movement minimized. The submarine settled to 90 m. Through the hull, the crew could hear the aircraft circling overhead. The sound of their engines transmitted through the water. The planes remained on station for 3 hours, dropping sonobu in a search pattern, waiting for the submarine to surface or make noise that would betray position. Eventually, as fuel ran low, the aircraft departed. U-853 remained submerged for 6 more hours, finally surfacing after dark to recharge batteries and refresh air. Summer filed a report of the incident upon return to base, noting the unusually rapid aircraft response following routine transmission. His report joined dozens of similar accounts from other commanders. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Something had changed in Allied detection capabilities. The technical specifications of the equipment hunting U-853 represented a generation beyond what German intelligence assessed the Allies possessed. The shipboard HFDF installation aboard Croatan and her escorts used the DAQ system developed by French engineer Henri Bazines and refined by American naval laboratories. The receiver could detect radio transmissions across the high-frequency band from 3 to 30 MHz. The Adcock antenna array mounted on a rotating platform for calibration purposes but requiring no rotation during operation fed signals to a cathode ray oscilloscope display with a circular screen approximately 12 cm in diameter. When a transmission occurred anywhere within several hundred kilometers assuming line-of-sight radio propagation, the display showed an elliptical pattern oriented along the bearing to the signal source. An experienced operator trained in a 3-week course that covered radio theory, antenna characteristics, signal propagation, and practical exercises could read the bearing within 5 seconds of signal detection. The accuracy ranged from 2 to 5 degrees depending on signal strength and atmospheric conditions. Multiple ships obtaining cross bearings could establish position within a circle approximately 15 to 30 kilometers in diameter, sufficient to guide aircraft or surface hunters to the target area. By June 1944, approximately 200 Allied warships carried HFDF equipment. The shore-based network consisted of more than 50 stations around the Atlantic perimeter from Iceland through Britain to Gibraltar and across to Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean. These installations formed an integrated detection grid managed from the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center in London and the U.S. Navy's F-21 section in Washington. Every U-boat transmission was logged, plotted, and analyzed. Patterns of movement could be tracked. Concentrations of submarines could be identified. Convoys could be routed away from danger areas. The disparity between German assumptions and Allied capabilities had become absolute by mid-1943. U-boat commanders believed 202 transmissions offered protection. In reality, those transmissions were completely transparent to HFDF networks. Submarines assumed they could transit areas undetected if they maintained radio silence. In reality, they were tracked continuously through regular position reports required by Donitz's command system. The operational doctrine designed to maximize effectiveness through coordination had become a vulnerability that Allied intelligence exploited systematically. Statistical analysis revealed the transformation. Between July 1942 and May 1943, when a transmission occurred anywhere within several hundred-kilometer assuming line-of-sight radio propagation, the display showed an elliptical pattern oriented along the bearing to the signal source. An experienced operator trained in a 3-week course that covered radio theory, antenna characteristics, signal propagation, and practical exercises could read the bearing within 5 seconds of signal detection. The accuracy ranged from 2 to 5 degrees depending on signal strength and atmospheric conditions. Multiple ships obtaining cross bearings could establish position within a circle approximately 15 to 30 kilometers in diameter, sufficient to guide aircraft or surface hunters to the target area. By June 1944, approximately 200 Allied warships carried HFDF equipment. The shore-based network consisted of more than 50 stations around the Atlantic perimeter from Iceland through Britain to Gibraltar and across to Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean. These installations formed an integrated detection grid managed from the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center in London and the U.S. Navy's F-21 section in Washington. Every U-boat transmission was logged, plotted, and analyzed. Patterns of movement could be tracked. Concentrations of submarines could be identified. Convoys could be routed away from danger areas. The disparity between German assumptions and Allied capabilities had become absolute by mid-1943. U-boat commanders believed 202 transmissions offered protection. In reality, those transmissions were completely transparent to HFDF networks. Submarines assumed they could transit areas undetected if they maintained radio silence. In reality, they were tracked continuously through regular position reports required by Donitz's command system. The operational doctrine designed to maximize effectiveness through coordination had become a vulnerability that Allied intelligence exploited systematically. Statistical analysis revealed the transformation. Between July 1942 and May 1943, Allied direction-finding networks managed to divert 105 out of 174 North Atlantic convoys away from Wolfpack ambushes. Another 23 convoys partially avoided contact. The majority of convoys that successfully evaded U-boat concentrations did so because HFDF intelligence provided advanced warning of submarine positions. Merchant ship losses declined. U-boat losses increased. The exchange ratio shifted decisively against Germany. The psychological impact of this technology emerged gradually among U-boat crews through accumulated experience rather than single revelations. Commanders returning from patrol would gather in officers' quarters at bases in France and Norway, speaking quietly about encounters that defied explanation. Aircraft appearing from clear skies within minutes of surfacing. Escorts that changed course directly toward their position after transmitting convoy contact reports. Depth charge attacks that began impossibly soon after sending routine signals to headquarters. Corvette and Captain Peter Kramer, commanding R-333, recorded in his patrol log during May 1943 that Allied escorts responded to his position with uncanny accuracy following weather transmissions. He noted that aircraft seemed to know his location despite maintaining proper radio discipline and keeping signals brief. After losing contact with a convoy he had been shadowing, Kramer wrote that he suspected the enemy possessed detection methods beyond his understanding. Similar observations filled patrol reports throughout the spring and summer of 1943. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain Lucknell Klaus Bston commanding U-521 experienced the technology's capabilities during a patrol in March 1943. His boat had located convoy HX-229 and transmitted a contact report to headquarters. Within 40 minutes, 3 destroyers appeared over the horizon, moving directly toward U-521's position. Barston crash-dived and evaded the initial attack, but the escorts remained overhead for 8 hours, conducting systematic depth charge patterns that forced the submarine to remain deep until battery power reached critical levels. Upon surfacing that night, Barston transmitted a situation report. Aircraft arrived within 20 minutes, the pattern repeated 3 times over the next 2 days. The technological asymmetry manifested in ways that German sailors found deeply unsettling. U-boat crews had been trained to believe their vessels offered invisibility beneath the waves. They understood that surface detection was possible, that lookouts or radar might spot a conning tower, but they had been taught that diving provided sanctuary, that brief transmissions offered security, that the ocean's vastness guaranteed concealment. Each of these assumptions was being systematically dismantled by technologies they could not see, could not fight, and frequently could not even comprehend. The British and American anti-submarine campaign had evolved into an integrated system combining multiple detection methods. HFDF provided initial contact and bearing. Radar allowed aircraft to locate surface submarines at night or in poor visibility. Sonar, called ASDIC by the British, detected submerged boats. Acoustic homing torpedoes pursued submarines autonomously once launched. Hunter-killer groups combined escort carriers with destroyer escorts, providing both air and surface pursuit capabilities that could track U-boat continuously from first detection through final attack. German countermeasures proved inadequate. The MTOX radar detector introduced in August 1942 could identify Allied radar transmissions in the meterwave band but was blind to the new centimetric radar operating at 10 cm wavelength. U-boat equipped with MTOS believed they had warning of air attack. In reality, they detected only older radar sets while remaining vulnerable to the newer systems carried by increasing numbers of aircraft. When a captured Royal Air Force pilot suggested during interrogation that British forces were homing in on Met emissions themselves, Donitz ordered the system discontinued in August 1943. This decision eliminated what little radar warning capability German submarines possessed. Attempts to minimize radio transmission through stricter discipline provided limited benefit. The operational system still required communication. U-boat needed to receive orders, report positions, transmit convoy sightings, and coordinate with other boats during Wolfpack operations. Even submarines that maintained near-complete radio silence had to surface periodically to recharge batteries, and Allied patrol aircraft now carried sufficient radar to detect surfaced boats at ranges beyond visual detection. The technological advantage had shifted so completely that traditional submarine operations became nearly impossible. In contested waters, the moment of recognition for many U-boat commanders came not through a single dramatic encounter, but through the mathematical reality of survival rates. In May 1943, 41 U-boat were lost from an operational fleet of approximately 160 boats. This represented a loss rate of 26% in a single month. The previous monthly record had been 18 boats lost in November 1942. Suddenly, losses had more than doubled. More submarines were being destroyed than German shipyards could produce. The casualty figures became impossible to ignore. Of the 1,156 U-boat commissioned during the war, 785 were lost to enemy action or accidents. 32,000 submariners served in the U-boat force. 28,000 died. This represented a casualty rate of approximately 87%, the highest of any major service branch in any belligerent nation during the war. By comparison, German infantry formations on the Eastern Front engaged in the most brutal ground fighting of the war, sustained casualty rates averaging 40 to 60% over sustained periods. These statistics filtered through the U-boat force gradually. The German naval command attempted to maintain operational security by segregating information between flotillas. Crews returning from patrol were not informed of losses in other units. Official announcements minimized casualties, but submariners talked. Men on leave visited other bases. Boats that should have returned from patrol simply vanished. The number of familiar faces decreased with each passing month. Captain Susan's Rudolf Rusing, who served as fur debut to West from July 1942 commanding all U-boat based in France, later recalled the psychological impact of mounting losses during testimony after the war. He described the period after May 1943 as marked by declining morale as crews recognized their chances of survival had become minimal. Young submariners reported for duty, knowing the statistical likelihood suggested they would not return from patrol. Experienced commanders requested transfer to training commands or administrative positions. The submarine service, which had been an elite assignment earlier in the war, became a death sentence. The technological explanation for these losses remained partially obscure to German sailors throughout the war. Donitz and his staff suspected that Allied direction-finding capabilities had improved significantly. Intelligence reports indicated that shipboard detection equipment had been widely deployed. Some commanders speculated about new types of radar. Others believed that Enigma encryption had been compromised, though this possibility was officially denied. The full scope of Allied technological advantage combining HFDF sentiment-rich radar, improved sonar, acoustic torpedoes, and signals intelligence from decrypted Enigma messages was not understood until after Germany's surrender. What U-boat crews did understand was that their training, their equipment, and their tactical doctrine had become inadequate against enemies who seemed to possess impossible capabilities. Submarines that attempted to shadow convoys found themselves hunted instead of hunting. Boats that transmitted routine reports attracted aircraft and surface ships with alarming speed. The ocean, which had once provided concealment and opportunity, had become a surveilled medium where every radio signal potentially marked position and every surfacing risked immediate attack. Vera Henke commanding U-515 captured this recognition in a report filed after a patrol in April 1943. He noted that Allied escorts responded to his submarine's presence with detection methods he could neither identify nor evade. He described being tracked continuously for more than 30 hours despite multiple course changes and depth variations. He concluded that the enemy possessed technical capabilities far exceeding German intelligence estimates and recommended fundamental revision of U-boat tactics away from coordinated operations toward individual patrol. His recommendation was noted but not implemented. The operational system remained unchanged. The submarines continued sailing, transmitting, and dying at rates that exceeded replacement capacity. By autumn 1943, Germany had effectively lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Though combat operations would continue through the war's end, Captain Lieutenant Helmut Schmerz and the crew of U-853 never fully understood the technology that hunted them during their weather reporting patrol in June 1944. After the encounter with aircraft from USS Croatan on the 17th, the submarine continued operations for another 8 days. On June 25, Summer attempted to attack the troop transport RMS Queen Mary loaded with American soldiers bound for Britain. The submarine submerged to attack position, but was outrun by the much faster liner. As U-853 surfaced in Queen Mary's wake, she was attacked by Fairey Swordfish aircraft from British merchant aircraft carriers. The submarine survived that engagement with minor damage. The final encounter occurred on June 17 after 10 days of relentless pursuit. HFDF equipment aboard Croatan detected another weather report transmission from U-853 at a range of 30 nautical miles. The escort carrier's crew had nicknamed their elusive target Moby Dick. After nearly 2 weeks of hunting, this time aircraft launched immediately, arriving overhead before the submarine could dive to safe depth. Depth charges and acoustic homing torpedoes bracketed the boat. U-853 attempted evasive maneuvers, diving deep, changing course repeatedly, rigging for silent running. The attacks continued for 6 hours. The submarine's luck ended on June 17, 1944 when coordinated attacks from multiple aircraft finally breached the pressure hull. U-853 sank in deep water west of the Azores. All 48 crew members died. Summer was 28 years old. The submarine had been operational for exactly 1 year. She had completed 1 war patrol. The official German casualty report listed the boat as missing, presumed lost with all hands. The exact circumstances of her destruction would not be confirmed until post-war analysis of Allied records. The broader pattern of U-boat losses continued through the final year of the war. Between June 1944 and May 1945, German submarines sank approximately 150 Allied merchant ships. During the same period, 192 U-boats were destroyed. The exchange ratio had inverted completely from the early war years when U-boats sank multiple ships for each boat lost. Now submarines were being destroyed faster than they could inflict damage on Allied shipping. Donitz attempted to salvage the submarine campaign through technological innovation. The Type 21 U-boat introduced in late 1944 represented a revolutionary design. These boats were true submarines rather than submersibles. Designed to operate primarily underwater, they featured streamlined hulls, enormous battery capacity, allowing sustained high-speed submerged running, and snorkel systems permitting battery recharging without fully surfacing. Most importantly, they were designed to minimize radio transmissions through increased operational autonomy. The Type 21 arrived too late. Production difficulties, Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities, and the general collapse of German industrial capacity limited deployment. Only 2 boats completed combat patrols before Germany's surrender. Even had these advanced submarines been available in larger numbers, they could not have reversed the strategic situation. The Battle of the Atlantic had been decided by mid-1943. The Type 21 represented German recognition that previous designs and tactics had become obsolete. But that recognition came after the war was already lost. The human cost of this technological asymmetry remained staggering through the war's end. Of the 1,156 U-boat commissioned, 785 were lost. The survivors surrendered in May 1945 following Germany's capitulation. Many boats received the coded Rainbow Order, directing them to scuttle rather than surrender. Approximately 220 submarines were deliberately sunk by their crews during the final weeks of the war. The remainder sailed to Allied ports and were eventually scrapped or used for technical evaluation. The submariners who survived faced complex psychological aftermath. They had served in a branch that suffered the highest casualty rate of any major military formation during the war. They had witnessed friends and shipmates die at rates that exceeded even the most brutal ground combat. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, questioning why they had lived when so many others perished. Some maintained pride in their service despite Germany's defeat, viewing submarine duty as honorable warfare against military targets rather than participation in the regime's criminal enterprises. Post-war interrogations of senior U-boat officers revealed the extent to which German command had underestimated Allied technological capabilities. When asked about HFDF, most commanders acknowledged suspecting some form of improved direction finding existed, but expressed surprise at learning the system could detect signals essentially instantaneously. Rosing, interviewed by Allied intelligence in 1945, stated that U-boat command had believed brief transmissions provided adequate security until accumulated losses forced recognition that enemy capabilities exceeded German assumptions. He noted that this realization came gradually through patrol reports rather than through any single intelligence breakthrough. The technology gap extended beyond HFDF. German submarines never developed effective radar warning receivers that could detect centimetric radar. They never matched Allied sonar performance. They never deployed acoustic homing torpedoes comparable to the American Mark 24. They never established an intelligence network capable of breaking Allied naval codes the way Bletchley Park penetrated Enigma. The cumulative technological disadvantage combined with Allied superiority in shipbuilding capacity and pilot training created an insurmountable strategic situation that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The legacy of HFDF technology extended far beyond World War II. The fundamental principle using radio emissions to locate transmitting sources became a permanent fixture of naval warfare and signals intelligence. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact navies maintained extensive direction-finding networks to track submarine movements. The technology evolved from manual oscilloscope displays to computerized systems capable of processing multiple signals simultaneously across broad frequency ranges. Modern electronic warfare suites incorporate direction finding as a basic capability integrated with radar, sonar, and communications intelligence systems. The lessons learned from the Battle of the Atlantic shaped post-war submarine development. The Soviet Union, which captured German Type 21 submarines and designed documentation at the war's end, built its submarine fleet around principles demonstrated by late-war German boats. The emphasis shifted toward true submarines capable of sustained underwater operations, minimizing time spent on the surface where they were vulnerable to radar and visual detection. Nuclear propulsion, introduced in the 1950s, finally achieved the operational capability. German designers had attempted to approximate through large battery banks and snorkel systems. The United States Navy absorbed technological and tactical lessons from both its own anti-submarine campaign and from captured German equipment. Post-war submarine design emphasized underwater performance, sound quieting to minimize sonar detection, and operational autonomy to reduce communication requirements. American submarines of the Cold War era were designed specifically to counter the direction finding and sonar networks that had proven so effective against German U-boat. The cycle of detection technology versus stealth technology that characterized the Battle of the Atlantic continued throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. The psychological impact on German naval culture proved profound and lasting. The Federal Republic of Germany's Navy, established in 1956, approached submarine operations with institutional memory of the heavy casualties suffered during World War II. Training emphasized caution, technological proficiency, and integration with Allied forces rather than the aggressive independent operations that had characterized the earlier U-boat force. Former German submariners who joined the new Navy brought with them hard-learned lessons about the dangers of underestimating enemy capabilities and the cost of inadequate technology. Several U-boat commanders who survived the war wrote memoirs detailing their experiences. These accounts consistently emphasized the psychological difficulty of operating in an environment where the enemy seemed to possess uncanny knowledge of submarine positions. Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most decorated submarine commanders who survived the war, wrote that the period after May 1943 felt like sailing into a trap every time we left port. He described the constant stress of wondering whether the next transmission would bring aircraft ahead, whether surfacing to recharge batteries would result in radar detection, whether even routine operations might prove fatal. The statistical analysis of U-boat operations conducted after the war by both German and Allied researchers confirmed that HFDF played a decisive role in Allied victory. The correlation between radio transmissions and subsequent attacks was overwhelming. Submarines that maintained strict radio silence survived significantly longer than boats that transmitted regularly. But maintaining complete radio silence while conducting offensive operations against convoys proved impossible given German tactical doctrine. The operational system Donitz had developed, which depended on centralized control and coordination through radio communication, contained the seeds of its own failure once the Allies deployed instantaneous direction-finding technology. Germany entered the war with experienced submarine crews, proven tactics, and reasonable equipment. Within 4 years, Allied technological development and industrial mobilization had rendered German submarines obsolete and extremely vulnerable. This pattern repeated across multiple domains. German tank designs that dominated in 1940 were obsolete by 1943. Luftwaffe aircraft that achieved air superiority over Poland and France were outclassed by 1944. The Kriegsmarine surface fleet became irrelevant once Allied naval production reached full capacity. The U-boat campaign represented Germany's most dangerous threat to Allied victory. If submarine warfare had succeeded in cutting the Atlantic supply lines, Britain might have been starved into surrender and the Allied invasion of Europe rendered impossible. The margin by which this threat was defeated remained narrow through early 1943. Technologies like HFDF combined with increased escort production, improved air coverage, and signals intelligence from Enigma decrypts tipped the balance decisively. The compound effect of multiple Allied advantages overwhelmed German capabilities despite individual acts of courage and tactical skill by U-boat crews. The story of German U-boat and HFDF represents a pattern repeated throughout military history. Technological advantage once established proves extremely difficult to overcome through operational skill alone. The German submariners who sailed against Atlantic convoys in 1943 and 1944 were not less capable than their predecessors who achieved success during earlier years. Their training was thorough, their equipment functional, their courage unquestioned. What changed was the technological environment in which they operated. The gap between German assumptions and Allied capabilities created a psychological dissonance that many U-boat commanders struggled to reconcile. They had been taught that brief transmissions offered security. Experience demonstrated that any transmission attracted danger. They believed the ocean's vastness provided concealment. Reality showed them being tracked continuously across thousands of miles. They trusted that diving provided sanctuary. Allied sonar and acoustic torpedoes proved otherwise. Each assumption carefully taught during training and reinforced by early war success collapsed under the weight of technological change. The moment Captain Lieutenant Summer authorized that weather transmission on June 17, 1944, he acted according to doctrine developed through years of experience. The transmission lasted 19 seconds. The Kurd signal code reduced message length to minimum necessary characters. The radio man executed the procedure flawlessly. Every precaution within German understanding had been followed. None of it mattered. The HFDF operator aboard Croatan obtained a bearing in seconds. Aircraft launched within minutes. The hunt that would end 10 days later began with a technology Summer could not see, could not fight, and only dimly understood existed. This pattern of technological surprise and belated recognition shaped the entire Battle of the Atlantic. German Naval Command knew direction finding existed but underestimated its capabilities. They suspected radar had improved but failed to develop adequate countermeasures. They believed Enigma was secure despite mounting evidence suggesting otherwise. Each miscalculation contributed to mounting casualties that eventually made U-boat operations unsustainable. The submariners paid the price for these institutional failures with their lives. The broader lesson extends beyond submarine warfare or even World War II. Military forces that fail to accurately assess enemy capabilities that continue operating on obsolete assumptions that cannot adapt to technological change and will suffer catastrophic losses regardless of individual competence or courage. The German U-boat force of 1943 through 1945 demonstrated this principle with mathematical precision. 87% casualties, 785 boats lost, 28,000 men dead. These numbers represent not merely tactical defeats, but strategic failure rooted in technological and institutional blindness. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic required more than just HFDF. It required the integration of multiple technologies: radar, sonar, acoustic torpedoes, signals, intelligence into coherent operational systems. It required massive industrial production to build sufficient escort ships and aircraft. It required training thousands of operators and maintainers for complex electronic equipment. It required institutional flexibility to adopt new tactics as technology evolved. Most critically, it required accurate assessment of both friendly and enemy capabilities, avoiding the comfortable assumptions that led German command to underestimate Allied technical development. For the men who served in U-boat during the final years of the war, these strategic considerations offered little comfort. They knew only that their chances of survival decreased with each passing month, that operations which should have succeeded ended in death, that the ocean, which once sheltered them, had become hostile territory. They transmitted brief signals as ordered and died when aircraft arrived impossibly fast. They maintained radio discipline and died when escorts appeared from over the horizon. They followed doctrine faithfully and died because that doctrine had become obsolete. The HFDF technology that helped doom the U-boat force represented a modest innovation in radio direction finding developed originally for tracking lightning, adapted for military intelligence deployed widely through Allied navies. The German U-boat force of 1943 through 1945 demonstrated this principle with mathematical precision. 87% casualties, 785 boats lost, 28,000 men dead. These numbers represent not merely tactical defeats, but strategic failure rooted in technological and institutional blindness. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic required more than just HFDF. It required the integration of multiple technologies: radar, sonar, acoustic torpedoes, signals, intelligence into coherent operational systems. It required massive industrial production to build sufficient escort ships and aircraft. It required training thousands of operators and maintainers for complex electronic equipment. It required institutional flexibility to adopt new tactics as technology evolved. Most critically, it required accurate assessment of both friendly and enemy capabilities, avoiding the comfortable assumptions that led German command to underestimate Allied technical development. For the men who served in U-boat during the final years of the war, these strategic considerations offered little comfort. They knew only that their chances of survival decreased with each passing month, that operations which should have succeeded ended in death, that the ocean, which once sheltered them, had become hostile territory. They transmitted brief signals as ordered and died when aircraft arrived impossibly fast. They maintained radio discipline and died when escorts appeared from over the horizon. They followed doctrine faithfully and died because that doctrine had become obsolete. The HFDF technology that helped doom the U-boat force represented a modest innovation in radio direction finding developed originally for tracking lightning adapted for military intelligence deployed widely through Allied navies.